We usually know the Roman legions as unstoppable warriors fueled by honor, discipline, and loyalty. But behind every shining armor, there was a supply network of unpredictable complexity and cost. Rome didn't build its empire solely with brave soldiers. It built it with debt. So how did Rome cover the cost of centuries of conquest? And why does it still matter today? Because the deeper you look into Rome's machinery of war, the clearer the picture becomes. War wasn't only fought on battlefields, it was woven into the entire financial system. And once that system started, it could no longer stop. Expansion wasn't a choice. It became an economic necessity. Does that sound familiar? Let's dive into the details together. In the early years of the Republic, the Roman army was made up of citizens. If you owned land, you could be drafted. Soldiers brought their own weapons and hoped to return to their farms after a short campaign. But as Rome grew, wars lasted longer and were fought much farther from home. The old model began to change. It was no longer enough to grab your spear and fight for a year. Trained soldiers were needed. That's when Rome wanted to centralize military financing. The state began paying its soldiers a salary. Not much, but enough to secure their loyalty. Then came the real transformation. Conquest turned into a direct source of income. Every new province meant new taxes, new slaves, new gold reserves, and new tributes. It was a self-financing loop. War fed more war. But here, the story turned both thrilling and dangerous. Rome didn't rely solely on taxes. It fell heavily into debt. During long or costly wars, like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic took out massive public loans from the wealthy elite, especially from the rising financial class, the equites. These weren't charitable donations. They were investment funds, and investors expected returns in the form of interest payments, tax collection privileges, and trade monopolies in newly conquered territories. Thus, war turned into a business model, and the more profitable it became, the more wars Rome started. Political power shifted to commanders who could promise spoils. Senators became shareholders of violence. Private contractors, the publicani, managed everything from logistics to tax collection, taking enormous shares from the top. It was military-industrial capitalism draped in a toga. And what about the debts? They kept piling up. To pay for military expenses and creditors, the state constantly had to find new sources of revenue. When conquests stopped or rebellions began draining the treasury, Rome turned to the oldest trick in the book: devaluing the currency. During Emperor Nero's reign, the silver content in the denarius coin began to be quietly reduced. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors continued the practice. A once reliable silver coin turned into a small, devalued promise. The result? Inflation, loss of confidence. And by the early 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. The wealth of the rich, however, kept increasing. Senators and the equites hid their fortunes in land and foreign assets, while the poor were forced to pay taxes with devalued money. Public service collapsed. Corruption was everywhere. And the economic burden of endless wars fell entirely on the lower classes, through inflation, forced labor, and conscription. This wasn't just a military collapse, it was a financial one. Now stop and look around you. Today, governments are run with massive budget deficits. Wars are financed through borrowing. Central banks quietly print money to cover the gaps. There are financial elites gaining fortunes through defense contracts and crisis profits. The only way for the economy to survive, whether military, monetary, or market-based, is through continuous expansion. Not exactly the same, perhaps, but the DNA feels disturbingly familiar. Rome shows us this: an economy built on constant expansion especially one fueled by war, eventually hits a wall. When there are no more lands to conquer, no more resources to extract, or no enemies left to fight, the system collapses inward. Debt remains, expectations remain, but revenue stops. That's when governments begin to feed on their own people. Rome turned to higher taxes, more currency debasement, and stricter control. Bread and circuses to silence the masses, while the elite built villas behind high walls. Sound familiar? Today, we don't call it tribute. We call it taxation, financial expansion, or economic stimulus. But the mechanics are eerily similar. Central banks create money. Governments spend more than they earn. The rich get richer. The poor do their grocery shopping with shrinking paychecks. Wars are still financed through borrowing today. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion in the war in Afghanistan. Most of it borrowed money. So who gets the contracts? Who earns the interest? Who ends up paying the price? Through inflation, declining services, and weak currencies. The answer is crystal clear. And just like in Rome, it's a self-feeding cycle. Once debt becomes the norm, you no longer need a crisis to print money. You only need to delay collapse. The extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the longer it lasts, the more everyone insists that everything's fine, until it's not. That's why economic history matters so much. These aren't empty stories. They're warning signs. When we look at Rome, we see a state that handed too much power to the wealthy, became addicted to expansion, devalued its currency from within, and crushed its citizens under impossible burdens. Not because it was evil, but because the system could no longer stop. Today, we live in a different kind of empire. Digital, global, and powered not by legions, but by capital markets. But the game has never changed. Money and power remain inseparable. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the poor. And financial illusions still work until they don't. So, what will your response be? Start by seeing the bigger picture. Because most people don't even look. Most think inflation is random. They confuse debt with freedom. And they believe growth can last forever. The Stoics would answer that with one word: delusion. You may not be able to live entirely outside the system, but you can understand it. You can stop playing the game blindly. You can build your true resilience, not just with money, but with awareness. That means not just learning personal finance, but studying monetary history. It means recognizing systemic stress instead of getting lost in market euphoria. And most importantly, it means asking the question, who profits when I don't understand? Because you were never meant to learn this. You were never meant to know how Rome financed its legions. Just as you're not meant to question how modern governments do it today. You're expected to stay distracted by headlines, GDP numbers, and political theater. Not by the authorities, not by the ones pulling the strings. But now, you're aware. And once you understand, you can't unsee it. Financial education isn't just about managing money or learning to invest. It's about decoding power, understanding systems, and seeing beyond the illusion of stability. So next time you hear about a new crisis, a new war, or a new stimulus, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask who borrows, who profits, and who ultimately pays the price. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: empires don't fall when enemies reach their gates. They fall when the math stops adding up, and no one tries to fix it. If this gave you something valuable, don't forget to subscribe. History holds all the answers, and I'll show you where to find them.